Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Hintz, and I'm a historian with the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first session of our three-day webinar series, Immigration and Innovation, New Perspectives. Before I introduce the museum director and our session moderator, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items and the mechanics of how we'll run the Zoom webinar. For the best viewing experience, we recommend launching the webinar directly in the Zoom app versus viewing through the Eventbrite on your web browser. Either way, in the upper right corner of your Zoom screen, there's a small square and some dots that say View. I would recommend selecting the speaker view. That will maximize the speaker slides on your screen. And once we switch to our panel discussion, you may want to change that to panel view. There is a control panel that runs across the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please select the closed caption button if you'd like to view the live CART transcription of the webinar. Please use the Q&A function to post questions for our panelists. You can start posting your questions at any time. They will go into a queue and the moderator will try to get to as many of your questions as time permits. Please use the chat feature to share observations and engage in conversation with your fellow attendees. There is a drop-down box and we encourage you to share your observations with both the panelists and the audience. With your questions and remarks in the chat, we thank you for adhering to the Smithsonian's Code of Conduct so we can maintain a respectful learning environment. Finally, we are recording this session, but please be assured that the attendees' cameras and microphones will be disabled during the webinar. After some captioning and post-production, we do plan to post these videos to the event website and to the Lemelson Center's YouTube channel in just a few days, so look out for those. As I mentioned, the Lemelson Center is located within the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The center was founded in 1995 thanks to the generosity and the support of the inventor Jerome Lemelson and his family. The Lemelson Center strives to educate and empower the public to participate in technological, economic, and social change. By drawing on and contributing to the Smithsonian's world-leading collection of artifacts and archives, the Lemelson Center's scholarship, exhibitions, educational initiatives, and public programming like this advance the historical study of invention and innovation, encourage children and adults to apply their curiosity to real-world problems, and showcase the diversity of inventors who have shaped world history. And we invite you to learn more about our work at invention.si.edu. Now, we invited the museum's director, Dr. Anthea Hartig, to kick off our webinar series, but unfortunately she's traveling today and she sends her regrets. However, she was kind enough to pre-record a welcome message for us, so I'll now invite Arthur to cue Anthea's video.
Anthea Hartig, the Elizabeth Macmillan Director of your National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. Given the immigration theme of today's program, it's important to remember that most of us or our ancestors arrived in what we know as the United States from somewhere else. So we gratefully acknowledge the precedents here in the Washington, D.C. area of the Piscataway, the Pamunkey, the Nacotchtank peoples. Wherever you are at this moment, let us give thanks to the first people on whose land we live, love, struggle, and work. The Smithsonian has a powerful convening role that's fundamental to the increase and diffusion of knowledge, our original mission statement from 1846. Furthermore, the Smithsonian and other museums, libraries, and archives, they all play an important role in documenting, interpreting, and sharing the stories of so many people, especially and including immigrants and inventors. Thus, we're thrilled to present this Immigration and Innovation New Perspectives program. You'll get to see some examples of our work in session 2 tomorrow, when one of our historians, Joyce Beatty, shows items from the national collections that we're honored to steward. It also makes me think of the programs and the exhibitions and the educational efforts we've done here at the museum. Many Voices, One Nation, Inventive Minds about immigrant inventors, our annual naturalization ceremony, our deep commitment to language justice, as of course the demographies of our nation continue to change and grow. This webinar series is an opportunity to hear directly from immigrant inventors as well as historians and economists and policy studies professionals who have advanced new scholarship on the outsized impact that immigrants have in the innovation economy. Researchers have suggested that immigrants account for 16% of all US inventors and almost 28% of all US entrepreneurs, despite representing only about 13.5% of the US population. So over the course of these next 3 days, this series will examine the factors that have made the United States a compelling, if complicated, destination for aspiring inventors, while we explore the attitudes and the mindsets that have driven their successes. We'll also consider how foreign-born inventors have been central to historic and contemporary policy debates concerning immigration, innovation, American competitiveness, and importantly, national security. The Smithsonian is honored and committed to convene informed conversations on these timely and important issues, empowering people to create a more just and compassionate future by exploring, preserving, and sharing the complexities of our past and our present. My lasting thanks to my incredible colleagues at the Lemelson Center, headed so ably by Dr. Arthur Demrich, and my thanks to the speakers and moderators, and to you, our audience, for your interest and your participation and your engagement. Thanks so much. Enjoy this incredible series and take the best of care.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for your patience with the little hiccup there. And thank you, Anthea, for her welcome remarks. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's session moderator, Arthur Demrich. I'll invite him to turn on his camera. And while he does that, I will introduce him, and then he in turn will introduce the themes of the session and today's speakers. So my colleague, Arthur Demrich, is the director of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian Institution. He's led research projects into the history of pharmaceutical innovation and regulation, chemical risk, and healthcare systems, and is currently researching the history of industrial revolutions and the governance of sports technology. Arthur has published in the fields of science and technology studies, history of technology, medical sociology, and business policy. He was previously an associate professor at the University of Kansas, an assistant professor at Harvard Business School, and a visiting professor at the China-Europe International Business School. Arthur holds a PhD from Cornell University and a BA from the University of Pennsylvania. Arthur, thank you so much, and take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Really happy to be here. Delighted to see such a great turnout. There we go. Sorry, clicking on my screen. So today's session is called History, Immigrant Innovation in the United States. So we know that inventors and innovators, both independent patent holders, but also research scientists and engineers working in large firms, are overrepresented relative to their demographics in the United States. Put differently, there are in fact more immigrant inventors than we might expect from a random sample. But American attitudes towards immigrants have varied widely over time, from open arms to open hostility. So the two speakers in this session are going to address and explore how changing patterns of immigration influenced American innovation, including both the push factors that led immigrants to leave their home countries and the pull factors that attracted them to the United States specifically. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Petra Moser. Dr. Moser is a professor of economics at New York University's Leonard N. Stern School of Business. Her research explores the effects of intellectual property on science, technological innovation, and artistic creativity. She also investigates the impact of immigrants on US innovation. She earned MA in International Relations from Yale University and holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Moser, over to you. And again, just to iterate, any questions people have as the session goes, please put them into the Q&A, and I'll be happy to convey them to the speakers.
Thank you. I cannot share my screen just yet. Somebody else is still sharing. Now I can. Thanks very much again. So I will talk today about lessons about the link between immigration and innovation that we can get from the 20th century. And so I think this period generally, so the question is I think is at the top of our minds, or many people's minds today, in part because the innovations that have been very important in the last couple of years reach back to immigrants. So if you've been vaccinated, then you probably know that the first vaccine was created by Turkish immigrants in Germany who founded BioNTech. And it was then produced by a company that was founded by German immigrants in the United States, Pfizer. But the big question is like whether these are just exceptions or whether there is something there more generally. And that's a question that I've tried to answer in some of my historical research. So we'll look at two different episodes here. The first one is a wave of immigration that came to the United States after 1933. And the other one is a restriction on immigration that took place in the 1920s. So let's start with the push, with the inflow of immigrants that started after Hitler took power in Germany. He dismissed anybody who had a Jewish grandparent from public service. That meant that lots of German professors, among many, many others, lost their jobs. It was the start of a wave of immigration that covered about 133,000 German Jews, according to one estimate. The difference in this, I think one of the reasons why this wave was really special is because these people were extremely highly educated. 20% of them were university graduates and about 2,400 were academics. We looked at chemistry professors. So amongst the many chemistry professors that were dismissed from German and Austrian universities, there were 26 chemistry professors that moved to the United States. And at least anecdotally, these people, though it was a relatively small group, revolutionized US chemistry. They included several Nobel laureates, but also people like Neubert and Casimir Fajans, who, even though they didn't win the Nobel Prize, were extremely prolific. So I think often people like to emphasize the upside of this enormous, of the U.S. Welcoming German Jews to the United States. But I think the reality was a little bit was not as rosy, because even back then it was extremely difficult for these people to get visas. So people talk about the Kafkaesque gridlock. Basically, many of them could not come to the United States, and I think a part of that was because they were still considered war enemies, so they were German. There's also a lot of anti-Semitism into the United States. So Karl Neubert, for example, was rejected by DuPont because he looked too Jewish. And then I think something we should keep in mind, that a lot of the large universities in the United States in the 1940s did not hire Jewish faculty. And in industry, it was really hard for these people to find jobs because they were in the 1930s. This was after the Great Depression. Lots of people were looking for jobs, and so these jobs were not offered to Jews if they didn't have to. The other issue is that they were German. So I'm German too. So there's certain cultural differences, which is that in Germany, there's at least traditionally, there was a little bit more of a distance between professors and anybody else. So they were kind of used to being treated extremely well, and they weren't often treated as well. So that made life a little harder. So again, let me just emphasize, these people were extremely they're extremely prominent. So Karl Neubert did not win the Nobel Prize, but still he was considered the father of biochemistry. He discovered and prepared, among many other things, a total of 7 enzymes. He wasn't dismissed immediately because he had actually been a World War I expert on artillery in the field of chemistry. So he was spared at first, but then he was forced to immigrate in 1938. So overall, let me just show you straight our results because we have kind of little time. So what we find in our analysis of US patents by US inventors is that American invention in the fields of the immigrants increased relatively dramatically or increased significantly after 1932. US inventors produced about 31% more patents in the research fields of immigrants after 1932. So then the question is like, well, how did this actually work? So let me show you a little bit on this. So I think the key mechanism here in the 1930s was that the arrival of these immigrants attracted other people to work in the same field. So specifically, once there was a really prominent German chemistry professor in a field, American inventors moved into that same field and then became extremely productive in those fields. And we can quantify that. And what we see is that there was about a 35% increase in entry into the fields of immigrants after 1932. So let me just sum up what we find about this first episode, this big push, this big influx of immigrants after 1932. So these refugees from the Nazis had a significant positive impact on American inventors. Roughly about 31% more patents in their fields produced by American inventors after they arrived. And the mechanism here was primarily by attracting new people, new Americans into their fields. And I didn't have time to show you this, but what we think happened is that young people came into these fields of the immigrants. But these immigrants were highly educated professors. So I think today, maybe even people who are not particularly immigrant friendly would say that, yes, okay, we can allow professors and we kind of maybe don't want to have these lower educated immigrants. And so that kind of leaves open the questions like, well, what if you can't actually really tell whether somebody's going to be an inventor later on? What about if people arrive, say early, they arrive as students or as children? And that is, I think, particularly important today when we have these big restrictions on immigration. So then we're looking, I'm going to show you this second episode of American history, when again we're looking at the 1920s. So just a brief background here. There was a dramatic change in the nature of immigration to the United States in the late 19th century. Until the 1880s, most of the immigrants were German-speaking or they came from the British Isles. After 1890, the sources of immigration shifted to Eastern and Southern Europe because of a number of different factors, push and pull. Among them is that there was competition with American grain, which reduced rural incomes, and then there's a lot of oppression and violence in Poland and Russia. And then the other thing is actually railroads were built, so it actually became easier for people to get out of these areas where they no longer wanted to live. So as a result of that, immigration, the share of immigrants from Eastern and Southern, from Italy and Eastern Europe increased from 8 to 80%. The immigrants who were there didn't like that. So this is Calvin Coolidge when he was still vice president. And he said the US cannot be a dumping ground. We need immigration, but we need the right kind of immigration. He also says that there are certain divergent people that do not mix, and we need an ethnic law. So I think the key characteristic of the 1920s law that I will tell you about is that these were laws that were restricted based on the country of origin of the inventors. So essentially what the US was trying to do was trying to keep out these undesirable immigrants. See on this, whatever that ugly insect is, it was like the immigrants were seen as vermin. They were supposed to, this is an article from the New York Times that calls them human vermin that are carrying typhus. And that was actually a lot of, this is not an exception, a lot of the newspapers at the time showed these destitute immigrants who were waiting at the gate of the United States. And he says here, okay, fine, we have to let you in because we have no law. Here again, you see the mafia and socialists and the slums of Europe coming in. So the US tries to stem this inflow of undesirables from Eastern and Southern Europe. So this is key, right? So they are trying to keep out these uneducated people. But the way they do it is they do it through national origins. So they do a literacy test in 1917. That doesn't work because basically these Russians, they cannot read. And then in the national origins quota of 1921, they tried to first limit the quota of 1921. They get the calculations wrong, so that doesn't work as well. So in 1924, they finally get it right. And in the new Nordic immigration policy, in the Johnson-Reed Act, so they set new immigration quota with the goal of keeping people, the races of men who are wholly dissimilar of the native-borns, out from the United States. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that if you're German or if you're British, you can still come in. But if you're from Russia or Italy, you can't. So there's a massive decline in immigration as a result of the act, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. Total immigration falls from 360,000 to 160,000, but there's a disproportionate decline from Eastern and Southern Europe. So for some of these countries, it's actually become so, the outflows get reduced so much that there are more people going home than they're coming in. What is, I think, is really important to understand that these policies stayed in place until 1965. This was not like something that happened in the 1960s and then was abolished. It's really something that happened that regulated immigration into the United States for much of the 20th century. It was abolished under with President Johnson in 1965. And then he said at the time, it's like only 3 countries were allowed to supply 70% of the immigrants. Men of needed skill and talent were denied entrance because they came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then he also says, this will never again happen. We will never again shade the gate to the American nation with the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege. So again, the goal was to keep out uneducated people, but it's really hard to do that, especially when people arrive at sort of at a younger age. And in this paper, what we're trying to do, we try to figure out how good the US was at filtering out these undesirable immigrants, or whether there was also an effect on scientists. So what I've been doing for the last, I guess now 7 years, is to collect data on scientists. And I am actually just using again the data that somebody else created before me. I'm just typing it up and cleaning it and matching it with other sources. And these data were originally created by James McKean Cattell. He's a super interesting person. He was the first professor of psychology. He founded the field of psychology. He was the one who established the field of intelligence, of study of intelligence. He did some practice on himself by doing hashish. Yeah, and so he was the editor of Science for nearly 50 years. And he collected a source, the American Man of Science, which I've been working with for 7 years now. So the data are really extremely rich. So I'm showing you a really short entry. I'm just going to show you one thing that we can do with this, which is that we know actually where people are born. So we know exactly, so that makes it obviously very easy to figure out who's an immigrant. Now we also know their birth year, which we can used to match the data with patents, which we'll use as a measure of invention. And I'll show you why that's important. The scientists in this data come mostly from the Eastern European scientists. When I call them Eastern Europeans, Italy will be in there. So they're coming mostly from Russia, Poland, and Italy. So when I told you that we'll use the name to improve our matches, or we use the name and the age of people to get a really good match between scientists and patents. And so essentially what we do is we use the age at which people apply for a patent to filter out patents that don't make any sense. And so what we kind of say is like, if you are applying for a patent at age 5, that's probably not your patent. And then we kind of use that to improve our matching. So we match on middle names, we focus on STEM, on the physical sciences, and then we also drop very common names. So we have really good quality data on scientists matched with patents. And then the next thing we do is we estimate how many scientists are missing from the United States by 1956. And we estimate that about 1,165 scientists were missing. That's about 38 missing scientists per year. So that's like a department per year. So that's like the equivalent of one physics department per year. And then we check what was the effect of missing all these people on American innovation. And then we use this, we kind of use text analysis. So we use the descriptions of the fields in the records that James McKean Cattell collected in here, this is the 1956 version. And we use those to define the research fields of scientists. This is a really nice way to define the research fields of somebody because it allows us to use the words that they use to describe their research to assign everybody to a field. So it's much cleaner than just saying, oh, I'm an engineer, I'm a physicist, because we can really identify the work that they do. And so what we see using that analysis is that after the quotas, invention by US scientists declines in the pre-quota fields of the Eastern European scientists. So what that means is that in the fields where Eastern Europeans were active, American invention declines after the quotas. And then I think the really scary part is that it stayed low afterwards. So the US did not recover from this. I want to quantify this a little bit more, is that after 1924, when these quotas were established, Americans patent about 68% less in the pre-quota fields of the Eastern European scientists. Again, let's talk about the mechanisms. So the first thing I'll show you is that there are fewer scientists working, fewer Americans working in these fields. So these fields are now less attractive. And again, that's a super persistent effect. And then they also, the people who work in those fields also patent less. So there are fewer people working in the fields and they're less productive. Let's dig a little bit deeper into the mechanism. So I'm just going to give you an example, which I feel like lots of economists know. This is Paul Erdős. Lots of economists know their Erdős number because it's how many collaborators are you removed from Paul Erdős. You have lots of collaborators. And we use this obsession with the connection to Erdős to figure out where the collaborators of Erdős lived. Erdős was denied an immigration visa in 1954. And we can kind of see what happens to the location of the people that he writes with. And what we see is that before Erdős gets kicked out, so he was traveling a lot and he spent a lot of time at Notre Dame, then lots of Erdős's co-authors are American. And after 1954, when he's no longer allowed to come in, he kind of doesn't cooperate, he doesn't collaborate with Americans so much anymore. Then he collaborates with people in other countries, mostly Hungary, where he lives. So if you look at that more generally, is that what we see is that when we look at the patents by the co-inventors and the co-inventors of Eastern and Western European scientists, what we see is that there's a relative decline of patents by collaborators of Eastern Europeans after the quotas. So one thing you might be worried about is like, well, maybe these Eastern Europeans just picked bad fields, right? They just like picked something that just didn't wasn't very successful. So we can actually look at that because there was no comparable change in Canada. So Canada at the time was also they didn't have the greatest policy. They didn't like Jews either, but they didn't care whether people were from Eastern Europe or from other parts of the world. So we used this to estimate a placebo for Canada to see whether there was a similar decline in innovation in Canada, and there wasn't. So Canada did not have this policy. Now, if what we see was due to selection, we should see a similar decline in innovation in Canada, but we don't. In fact, actually, innovation in Canada increases relative to innovation in the United States. Let me talk about aggregate effects. So at the aggregate level, what we find is that firms who employed Eastern European born immigrants patent 53% less after the quotas. So firms that employed immigrants, Eastern Europeans, became less inventive. Then one thing you may wonder, like, well, I'm just talking about effects on the United States. But what about other places? So obviously, the places that these immigrants left were not very friendly to them in the first place. So the effect on those places was negative. But maybe some places actually benefited from getting them. And so I think the most striking here is Palestine. Palestine then became Israel. And so here, what we see is that immigration increases to Palestine, Israel, to Palestine after the quotas. So essentially, there are lots of stories of people wanting to move to the US but not being able to, and then instead they would move to Palestine. And these people actually had an enormous effect on innovation in Israel. So this is Aaron Katz here as one example. He founded polymer research at Israel's Weizmann Institute of Sciences, which is still really important today. And then another example is Giulio Racca, who fled Italy and founded the Institute for Theoretical Physics at Hebrew University. So overall, these quotas led to like the absence of more than 1,000 scientists in the United States. That led to a dramatic decline in US invention. US scientists produced 68% fewer inventions, roughly. There were fewer scientists in the pre-quota fields, fewer American scientists, and they also produced fewer patents. And this, I didn't have time to show you this, but if you're just focusing on people who are born in the United States, which we can do in our data. So if you say, like, I don't care about any of these immigrants, but there's a dramatic decline in innovation for just the US born. And we think that this refusal of the United States to take these immigrants created some gains for other countries. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Petra. My video isn't, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you again. That was wonderful. Really appreciate that. And so I'm now pleased to introduce our second speaker. And so we're going to invite him to talk, and then we're going to do a bit of general discussion and then Q&A from the audience. So again, the audience, we encourage you to submit questions at any time. So our second speaker in this session is Professor William K. Kerr. He's the Darbeloff Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, Unit Head of Entrepreneurial Management at HBS, co-director of Harvard's Managing the Future of Work initiative, and faculty chair of the Launching New Ventures program. Among his major research projects include his recent book, The Gift of Global Talent: How Migration Shapes Business, Economy, and Society. Professor Kerr holds a PhD in economics from MIT, and hopefully is getting his camera on now.
I think it should be on.
Looks great. Thanks.
At least I can see myself.
No, over to you. Thank you.
Let me share my screen here, and want to thank everybody for joining today. Obviously, I appreciate Petra kicking us off and the historical background that she brings to this. I will give a candid reflection that I hope that we don't think of my session or part of it as too much history, even though Eric and Arthur have kind of teed it up as a historical perspective. And the reason being that my analyses are going to start in 1975, and I was alive in 1975. And so I don't really want to pigeonhole this too much as to being history. We can think of it also as kind of a, the run up from when Petra's wonderful analyses ended and mine kind of begin from there. A second thing I'd like to just highlight is I had a chance to scroll through a few of the participant names, and I see some friends and some colleagues and some scholars. And so I appreciate you joining. And I think of this as kind of a lot of our perspectives that are being put into place. So I'm going to be a little bit more I think academic-y to get started here, or quizzy or something. And I want to give you 3 true false questions to highlight or to think about. Eric and Arthur kind of brought to the notion here that we're often trying to understand or sift through data. We're trying to identify new sources of information. We are trying to really kind of shape up our understanding of global talent flows and how they're affecting invention and immigrant inventors. And so I want to kind of give these 3 questions for you. Do you think that the net migration of inventors, meaning inflows going into, but subtracting out those that are leaving, the net migration into Finland is higher or lower than it is into Canada for inventors? A second question is, if I think of the San Francisco Bay Area and broadly Silicon Valley, Oakland, and so forth, do I believe that the patenting that is being done by Indian and Chinese ethnic inventors in that area is greater than or equal to the patenting that's being done in Boston, where I'm sitting right now? And then the third one is, in 2030, will the number of young college graduates, 25 to 34 years old is how we're defining that, will the number of young college graduates in Brazil exceed the number that are in Western Europe as a whole, combined up? I give you these because we're going to answer some of these as we go, and hopefully be able to see a little bit of how global talent flows are shaping our world. So the funny thing about a book, if you do it through an academic press, is that it goes through the same peer review process as what was done with Petra's academic papers. And as we all know, the academic process can be at times, a full contact sport. So they're not going to hold any punches. And this was the case in my book as well, which I'm pulling this talk from. So I sent out a first draft to the reviewers that Stanford University Press had picked out. I had this, what I thought was colorful example using the Olympics and how many countries get their basketball teams suddenly receive a lot of NBA players coming back home, or their hockey teams from Canada and the US based upon their return to play in the games. And the reviewer had some harsh words among other, which is, this is kind of childish, like, show me that this really matters, that talent flows of individuals are really important. And unfortunately, it was for me, I think, far too easy, because I got these reviews in 2017. And on my desk that day, when I'm looking at the reviews, was this Business Week article that had come out. This is the cover that was there. And the cover is "What a Murder in Kansas Says About Politics, Immigration, and Tech." And the story was one of those that really punches you in the gut. It talked about a town in Kansas, Olathe, Kansas, that had built up a tech industry, or a little tech community, in large part through global talent flows. So it had certainly many US-born scientists that were working in the areas. Garmin was one of the very big employers in town, but there was a heavy foreign tech presence. And early 50s white male one evening was enraged and stormed into the bar and yelled, "Get out of my country." And he shot two of the immigrant tech workers, unfortunately killing one of them in the process. The article then went on to describe some of the tensions that were being experienced all around the world with respect to immigration, migration, not just exclusively in lower education settings, in higher education as well, and some of the challenges that nationalism was surfacing on this. But what was also interesting about this particular business week is that there were 5 or 6 other articles, and the ones that I put on the right-hand side are word for word what the title was saying. Early on in the May issue was, as Venezuela implodes, its young professionals flee for a chance in the United States to put their talents to work. Unfortunately, that situation has continued to be a big struggle and deteriorated since 2017. There was a kind of humorous article about Cyprus's passport to growth. It estimated about 25% of its GDP came from basically selling citizenship that included EU membership. I kind of broadened that from that to say that most every country, if you're wealthy enough and you're willing to pony up enough money, will find a way to have you come into the country. There was one that was about the race for autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, and how the need for greater technology in those cars was shifting some of the locus away from Detroit and towards the West Coast, and how they were kind of struggling to keep up with that talent access. There was one that was particularly scary for my position at a business school. It was a Trump slump for U.S. business schools. We've had a lot of research that has talked about how what we call the education pathway. People come and study either in high school in the U.S. or undergraduate or an MBA program with the aspirations of staying for work afterwards. And this article was highlighting that the tensions around whether an immigration visa would be possible and how that was diminishing the attractiveness of U.S. business schools. And then there was a final article about Dara, who came as an Iranian refugee. At 2017, he had risen to be Expedia's CEO. And about 3 or 4 months after this, he went on to become Uber's CEO, where he remains today. And there were some other pieces here. And the important point, this was not a special issue about immigration. It was not something that was deeply tied to some globalization phenomenon, but global talent was kind of sitting all through this article. And I think it's important for us to kind of both around the invention, where I'm going to spend most of our conversation today, but at a higher level, frame how impactful this is for our society. So there's a lot of things that you would expect to find as you come forward over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and they're certainly going to show up in the book. One of the places, and this goes back to Petra's wonderful work, that we've been able to think about kind of the impact of immigration in our science progress, is related to the Nobel Prize, kind of circling Bengt Holmström, who in 2017 was winning the Nobel Prize and is based out of MIT. In the economics department. That year, 6 of the 7 US recipients were foreign born. And in general, about a third or a bit higher than that of our Nobel Prize winners over the course of the last century have been foreign born coming into the US. And as we have won ever more with immigrant talent, we've also won ever more with domestic US born talent as well. There was, not surprisingly, conversation about the tech firms. This is Bill Gates's famous testimony about the H-1B visa program to Congress. Continues to be a place where the tech industry is lobbying heavily. And certainly one would have expected, and we'll find a little bit of President Trump and some of his policies. But I think what may be a surprise for many people is that he really doesn't show up until the very end, the final section, and plays a relatively small part. And that's because a lot of what I'm going to be showing and describing during my time today is a process has been playing out in the US over the last 50 years. And independent of who won in 2016, we would have some of the same benefits that we've received, and also we would have had some of the same challenges that our system has been providing. And so we're surfacing that. He clearly made the country more antagonistic towards migrants, and that detracted, but there's a bigger process that I want to show you today. There's other pieces that maybe were not as visible, but we're trying to use this as an opportunity to surface up and see the various angles. There's questions about captured up in this top left corner about the degree to which older workers in the tech industry find it hard to compete with younger talent, and to what degree do tech firms use skilled migration and younger inventors to keep their workforces younger and therefore less expensive compared to perhaps their output. There's questions down at the bottom here about, well, many other countries want to have a greater share of this. How can they work to compete for some of the talent that the US either has or is not, being an easy place to enter into. So we go through programs like Startup Chile and Canada's efforts. And then there are some of the challenges that are captured on the right-hand side about the talent clusters like the Bostons and the New Yorks and Silicon Valleys, and the degrees to which some people are very concerned about how that's reshaping their cities and housing prices and so forth, and asking, what share do we get in? And so what I'm going to try to do in this book, not going to be able to do any kind of justice for it today, is try to shed a lot of light on both the really positive sides of this and also some of the challenges that we face, with the hope that that allows us to craft better policies and think about how to continue to improve this benefit or this gift that's come here. So one of the questions is, to begin, is the US doing something special about invention? And I want to focus our conversation around that for the next 10, 15 minutes. And the answer is assuredly yes. And so when you look at global talent flows, we haven't really had great data on this until some recent efforts by the World Intellectual Property Organization to bring together lots of patent databases and harmonize them and so forth. But what I want to show you is work that was done by WIPO to describe the net migration of inventors during the decade from 2000 to 2010. And the numbers that are above the horizontal axis, these numbers, are the inflows into a country. So this is when an inventor has moved from their country of birth into a country and is doing inventive work. And the numbers that are darker gray that are beneath that are the outflows. And the dots are kind of the net inflows minus outflows. And so one thing you're going to see, regardless of your screen size and whether you're watching this on a smartphone or on a big panel, is that there's a very strong outlier over here, which is the United States. And so during this period, the US had received approximately 57% of the global migration of inventive talent coming into the country. And that number is really pretty comparable to, if you looked at Nobel Prize winners, also that kind of level of percentage capture. And that one we can do over a longer time span than this. You can see over here the answer to our first trivia question, which is Finland comes in about fourth on this number. So they're pretty even in terms of inflows and outflows. Whereas Canada, while it does receive more inbound talent, on the whole, has had more people leave to go and work in other environments, typically the United States. And in fact, you can see a lot of what we think of as traditionally immigrant heavy receiving countries also can have a lot of outbound migration into other locations. And we'll be able to talk a little bit later about some of the implications of that. But the US has clearly had a special role and has had a role that has really helped benefit the science establishment here. Now, an important question is, how different is this? This with some history, did it just start in the year 2000 or does it go back further? And this is where Petra and my work are going to start to interface a little bit as we try to put together a little bit of a map here. And I want to ask you to take a look at this. This is actually the only non-US slide I think I have here today, but this is the most common surnames of Italian entrepreneurs during early 2015. And if I ask you to make an inference from this, we're not interactive, so I can't like stare at you. But my guess is you would have realized or picked up that there appear to be some Chinese and Indian common surnames among the Italian company founders. And Rossi would have been a common Italian surname. And what you're kind of mentally doing here is something that I've been working on, well, really going back to my my doctoral work a long time ago, is we don't have for the United States great records like Petra's that clearly identify where somebody's born. But with digitized patent records that start in the 1970s going to present, we can infer somebody has the last name Chen or Hu, that they're more likely to be of Chinese origin. Rossi, they're more likely to be of Italian, and so forth. And so it gives us an opportunity to try to characterize what has been the shape of ethnic talent flows for the United States over this period. Now, clearly not every instance where you see someone with the last name Singh is an immigrant into the country. And likewise, you have many people who are immigrants, but their surname would not, we're not indicating. We also use middle names, first names, and so forth. So this gives us, though, a snapshot of if you apply this procedure, what has been the change in the US inventive workforce since the 1970s? And what I'm showing you here is the shares of some common groups. So Chinese, Indian ethnic names, Hispanic ethnic names, other Asian, this includes Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and some other categories I can distinguish, Russian. And let's start with the groups that are not on this graph. So if you were to look at both a large European ethnicity, where I really have a hard time asserting immigration or not, you saw Petra's work, so they've typically been in the, could have been in the country for quite some time, and those that have Anglo-Saxon names. So those start in 1975, European Anglo-Saxon names at about 90%. So this would shoot way off the top of your screen and keep on going up, all the way to your ceiling. Over time, those have been declining to where they're about 66% today. And the share that do not have Anglo-Saxon and non-European names start about 1 in every 12 patents in 1975, and they've grown to be about 1 in every 3 patents. You're clearly seeing two lines that I don't think you would have found too surprising upon reflection that have been growing the most during this period. Both Indian and Chinese start at less than 2% of US ethnic invention, and Chinese today is around 11%, and Indian is rapidly approaching 10%. So this has been a significant contribution towards the growth of our global talent workforce. Now, I'm going to skip now a bunch of things where we could go. We could look at different technology fields. We could look at different institutional categories. We could look at Harvard University, and we could look at Microsoft. One of the nice things about this approach is that if you do this and you buy into it, you can then do it for any institution because of all the patent records. You can look at teams and so forth. What I want to do is highlight one example of the significance this can have for our world beyond just the numbers, just beyond just this quantity aspect. How can this reshape important parts of our innovation landscape? And so let me go back again to 1975. If we were in 1975, about 1 in every 220 patents that was filed in the United States would have had either a Chinese or Indian ethnic inventor as a member of the patent team. Maybe a single authored patent, it may be a collaboration with someone else, but they would have touched about 1 in every 220 patents. And that probably would have been, important enough for a local news story, but I don't think it would have, really been on the minds of CEOs and university presidents and politicians and so forth. If you come to 2020, and I've updated this chart every few years, and this number keeps getting a little bigger. Today, it's about 1 in every 10 patents. So 1 in every 10 patents in the US has either an Indian or Chinese ethnic inventor living in the Bay Area as part of the patent team. Now, to put that in perspective, the answer to our first trivia question, or I'm sorry, it's the second trivia question, is this contribution is greater than the entire patenting output of the Boston area, which is arguably the second largest patenting cluster in the country. In fact, it's greater than the whole state of Massachusetts. And it's even greater than any other state with the exception of California. And perhaps more striking to think about this is if I take the state that contributes the least amount of patenting. I add in the second least, third least, fourth least. So I'm adding up states in terms of the reverse order of how much they patented. You can take the bottom 30 states of the country, and they're going to be about 1 in 10 patents that they've been a part of. And so this is an astounding kind of reshaping of our innovative landscape. And through much of the 70s and 80s, in fact, innovation was becoming more spread out across the country. And due to features that include global talent flows, it's increasingly concentrated itself back into some of these tech centers. And this has impacts that go well beyond just local policy. It goes into questions of, if you are leading a multinational company, you're probably trying to say, how can I understand better what's happening in Silicon Valley? How can I be close to that sort of talent flows? So that's kind of again, an example of the ways that this is reshaping our lives. And I'm going to be coming closer to the end now, but let's do a quick kind of sense of, then why is it that it was over the last 50 years in particular, with the earlier work that Petra described also, that kind of start, why is it that it was US STEM? And I think there are several important pieces. Let's just bang a few of them out here. One is that skilled individuals in the United States get paid a substantial amount of money. So we have higher wage premiums. We have, an economic base for how we do skilled work that often allows these clusters to form and make it attractive for more people to be in it. This was inventive work is something that's relatively portable. It's probably more portable than marketing talent, for example. And so that can help bring it over here. The US had the head start that Petra described. It had the universities that were there. It has probably a good dose of luck that's involved in it. There's also a couple other things, though, that let me quickly sort of, engage or run through here, which is that the US has a structure for its immigration decisions that gives a lot of power over to firms. And I'll quickly contrast this by saying, go to Canada's skilled worker page. I use slightly older versions of these because I don't want to have the COVID and so forth as being kind of front and center on it. But this is for a step in the process towards getting a skilled worker immigration visa to Canada. And this is a center that first I kind of point, I love to show this in class, I sort of say, this is like in many ways, a marketing dream. You have here, some guarantees about free online evaluation. You're given some 48-hour guarantee. There's someone, chatbot individual is there ready to help you. An important part of the Canadian system is that it, in many respects, is kind of a leading with this idea of an individual-centered approach, often sometimes called a point system. And I guess I should have stepped back and said one thing. We're going to talk about quickly a point system and employer-driven systems. And I want to recognize that every country is a hybrid. So I'm kind of Canada's leaning towards more the point system than the US. The US is leaning more towards the employer system than Canada. We have elements of both of these in our systems. But let me kind of give a little sense of this. So you have that you're making this application to Canada. And if you go down a little bit, you can find ways that you can sort of judge how attractive you are seen to be for the country, in terms of your educational background, your language ability. Do you know French or not? Do you have relatives in Canada? Your age, younger people get more points than older people. So you're trying to kind of build up and understand your attractiveness, and this lets you be put into certain pools that you can then kind of take the next step in the immigration process. What's important about a lot of the US policy is that it leans again in that opposite direction. So here is the most important thing of the US system is it starts with, you must have an employer-employee relationship with the petitioning US employer, meaning that you are that Microsoft or Harvard University or Ford Motor Company makes the lead step in terms of thinking about who they want to hire and bring in. And I won't have time to go through all of the nuances of that. And I kind of highlight in the book that there's, it's sort of like, there's a lot of positives, a lot of negatives for making this approach. But it goes also, again, to this question of like, why was it US STEM? And tech employers have particularly found it useful, immigration a useful route in the country to help build out their inventive workforces alongside these other pieces. So as part of it was the US structure that was heading in, and then part of it was an immigration background on there. So let me wrap up here by giving the answer to my final trivia question, which is, what does the future look like for us? And I think we're going to see a lot of continuation. If you look back at those earlier trends, all of them were sloping upwards, and we're continuing to rise, increase higher. But we're also going to experience a world that's going to have a much more broad base of college graduates that could think or could tilt some of these balances back in new directions here. So going back to 2000, when many of us kind of maybe still think about some of the world structures and environments, at this point in time, about 2/3 of young college graduates were in traditional OECD countries and organizations. When we look out to 2030, according to the OECD numbers, Brazil won't, the last question was false, Brazil won't be more than Western Europe. It's going to be close. But I think the bigger number I would like to circle down here is the 18%. So 18% will be in North America and Western Europe, and you're going to see many more globally distributed teams. High skilled migration and talent flows are still going to be vital for all the reasons that we described. And firms, organizations, universities are going to be seeking to keep up with that new environment. So thanks for the opportunity to share, and I look forward to some Q&A time.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Bill. That was wonderful. And Petra also. So the floor is open for people to submit questions. I encourage our attendees to do so. And let me just start with one that kind of flips the story on its head for just a moment. And I wonder if you could both comment a little about the perspective or viewpoint from the countries that have lost talent. And so, of course, we've heard the term brain drain, which was used, probably from about the late 60s, early 70s on, especially in thinking in relation to developing countries. But obviously, and Petra told the German story in the 20th century. Germany, of course, lost a huge wave of immigrants after the failed 1849 revolution in Germany and other kind of periods. So there's been a wave upon wave. Often that's thought about in terms of technical experts. So think about, say, physicians or nurses or particular, I don't want to call them trade, but particular skill sets. And when we think about inventors, it's kind of broader than that, right? You don't need a particular degree to be an inventor. It kind of cuts more generally. And I'm just wondering if you think, have countries really systematically lost something in terms of invention and patenting in the same way that they've lost having a larger pool of physicians or a larger other employment base?
I'm happy to commence with a contemporaneous perspective, and maybe Petra's got a longer arc to it. Some of my earliest work was around this question of, when talent goes abroad, do they maintain a linkage back to their home country? And I think we should be first clear that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. So there's 180 countries around the world. There's going to be many variations of this. If it is a country that a U.S. business, an employer of the immigrant or university has a way to connect with, then I think the networks that can be built through these global talent flows can be quite beneficial to the sending country. So we don't tend to think of things in terms of just pure distance. Networks matter a lot in terms of how finance flows, trade flows, FDI flows, and so on. And the second piece that is interesting, and in some respects, kind of the surprise I found of global development, I certainly would not have anticipated this, is that the aspiration to go abroad has been found to be really, motivating for kids to make substantial investments in their training. And the reality, though, is that most of them don't end up going abroad. And so this kind of linkage or the opportunity to possibly migrate can have a substantial impact on how people are investing in their own education backgrounds, and that can in turn benefit a sending country.
That's actually fascinating, just before Petra jumps in, because you've kind of flipped it on its head in that analysis and said, it's not about winning or losing. It's actually a kind of rising tide floating all boats in effect. By building out those international networks, we see net gains in both sides of the equation.
Well, I guess to go all the way to a rising tide lifts all boats, I think we do need to differentiate a little bit. Perhaps the best case scenario is when global talent is, inside of a large U.S. company, and they're thinking about where they're going to place R&D efforts. But to say that a landlocked African country is going to have the same experience as an East Asian tiger is quite different there. And so you probably are going to rely more on remittances or other kinds of, exchanges that are migrant based. Whereas probably the really sort of beneficial impacts happen when it brings somebody into the sort of the global talent economy and in the value chains of corporations and so forth.
Very interesting. Petra, on the same question I was asking.
So first, historically, so in the 2 episodes that we've been looking at, the conditions in the home countries were horrible. So there was a brain drain for other reasons. So I think that was actually, it would have been a net gain if more people had arrived in the United States, if more people had been let in. And I think we can see similar situations today in the world where there's places where it's not good to be a scientist. And again, this goes back to Bill's point about it's not one size fits all. So would, for example, Germany like to have a lot of us back? Well, probably yes, right? But then I think that's kind of difficult because as people get older, they form personal ties to this new country, and then it becomes really hard to move back. So yes, but say if you think about, if they think about Germany in the 1930s, that was a net gain that people actually would go and find other places to be. And then I think the way I think about this more is like, well, if the US didn't take them, where did people go instead? And again, that really depends on the conditions in that place. Lots of people also went to Argentina. Didn't seem they had a huge effect on Argentina at the time. But in Israel, there were much better conditions to create like a domestic scientific base. So it depends what people's conditions are at home, and then where they go, whether that actually is a fruitful place. It's never just, there's always an interaction with the receiving country and with the sending country. But then one thing about like Bill's point about these networks, let me just go back to the example of Pfizer and BioNTech. When BioNTech was looking for production facilities, they put them to Turkey. And so I think there's no other reason to pick precisely that country than it is like this kind of, at least in part, this desire to bring something back to the country that was the country of origin of 2 of the founders. So there are these benefits, I think, going back as well.
No, that's fascinating. And it shows, no matter how large economies get, how large these corporations get, personal networks remain of some significance and importance. So second question I wanted to ask, and then we have several coming in from the public viewers, is do you have a sense of how important the intellectual property, the US patent system specifically has been in drawing people? Or is it more that for inventors, it's about venture capital, funding the support structures that are around an entrepreneur and inventor in the US? Or is it really just people come because of all the other factors that influence immigration, and then the intellectual property system, the venture capital system, the other aspects that help support inventors in America are kind of an add-on bonus?
Can I just talk about patents first? So I've worked a lot on patents, and I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning saying, I want to go to the United States because they have this awesome patent system, right? It's more like, There's a ton of litigation, right? I mean, the American patent system is not this fantastic pull factor like that draws people in. I've never heard anybody say that. So I don't think, I think nobody's coming because of the patent system. Or maybe, again, it depends how bad your patent system is in your home country. But in absolute terms, I don't think that's a huge pull factor. I think a bigger pull factor might be education. Lots of people come to get educated because the US in many fields is at the forefront of science. So people aspire to come here because they want to learn. And then the other thing is capital as well. So I would say, and also freedom, right? The freedom to fail. So I think as a European, I always sense this cultural difference. It's totally fine to mess up here. Right? It's like you fail in a company, it's cool, right? You've tried. Whereas where I come from, that's not acceptable. So I think it's much better, even though I think you have a better social safety net, but the psychic costs of failure seem to be much lower here than they would be in Europe.
Yeah, it's ironic that European social welfare nets don't actually promote security to fail as a startup in the same way one might expect them to. But Bill, back to, do you have anything to add to this core question around kind of the pull factors?
I certainly agree with all of the things Petra just described. And a couple of pieces I would add on top of that. One is we should recognize that the US has a tremendous amount of diversity to it. And you have places that are as different as Boston is from LA and Seattle from Miami. And that gives an amazing amount of opportunity and space for people from all around the world to find a place where they're gonna fit and they're gonna be home. And then from an entrepreneur's perspective, and invention being kind of tied into that, and the Moderna example that was given earlier, we shouldn't underestimate that you have the world's largest product market that is all under a single language and is relatively competitive in terms of its access points and so forth. And that's a pretty powerful condition to be working and founding businesses under. I would make one though, Arthur, other point is kind of looking towards the future. We've looked a lot towards the past, towards the future. So I've been at Harvard Business School now since 2005. And if I characterize 2005 to, let's call it 2012, 30, so at some point in time, most foreign-born entrepreneurs would tell you they are definitely not going home. Like their goal, if they could, make it through the immigration system, was to stay in Boston or the Valley or elsewhere to do it. And it's still the case that there's, that leaning, but it's quite different over the last 10 years in terms of the number of people that are saying, I want to go back to India, or I want to go to Shanghai. And these things like capital and entrepreneurial ecosystems and so forth are starting to spread. And so that, is not something I think the US should just rest on its laurels and say, hey, we've got it. We've got that always going for us.
Great point. Great point. So there's several questions from the audience. Let me start with one that's kind of focused particularly to Petra's work. So you suggest the arrival of immigrant inventors in the United States does not seem to crowd out US-based inventors. Instead, the US-based patenting increases with the arrival of the immigrant inventors. And the question is, what is the social mechanism or explanation there? And the observation then, this seems to undermine arguments about immigrants taking US jobs.
The way I think about it is that there are very specific sets of skills. So the people I look at for the most part are highly skilled. They're either highly skilled when they arrive or they become highly skilled. And so they have a very specific type of talent that is very difficult to replace. So I think then the spillover effects, the positive spillover effects, tend to outweigh the negative effects of having to compete with these new arrivals. It's also, we are not distinguishing in this last paper, we're not distinguishing between different types of people who are already in the United States. If you were to ask me who gets hurt and who benefits, I would think it's always the more vulnerable workers who get hurt. Say it might be older workers, or it might be workers in fields that are less thriving at the moment. So then, say if you think about grant money, if you have a bunch of really good immigrants coming in, then maybe these new immigrants get the grants instead of the other workers. So I think there are people who are differentially differentially vulnerable to competition, but the aggregate effect overall is bigger, because I think in large part because having these exceptionally gifted people coming in brings in new people, allows other people to actually learn. And those are the spillovers, the positive spillovers.
But those spillovers actually require a certain amount of network building, right? So I'm curious, and Bill, you may want to comment on this too, how it is that immigrants at some level have this incredible success at building out networks to have all these people, patent in the same domain then, in effect. They must know each other, they must be coordinating in some mechanism, or is it really that patenting area grows simply because they're there, the innovation comes, and then others see it and build on it?
Well, I'll let Petra come back maybe with the real story in a second here, but I'll interject that my, my lens to always thinking about the question of crowding in or crowding out type effects is, to what degree is growth possible? There is no way that we've tapped all the invention that we want to have, all the products that we want to have, all the, the size of the economy that we're hoping to achieve. Climate risk, put aside here for a minute. And so the capacity for an entity to grow, and Petra in some of her work was looking a lot at firms, that provides new products that they can sell, and there can be a lot of growth around it. If you find settings that are scarce constrained, like there's only a couple number of slots, then you're more likely to find some kind of deterioration at the margin. But I think in most cases, we think of invention as being a propellant to a growth process at a firm level, at a country level, and so forth. And that leans you towards thinking that this can have a more positive, beneficial spillover.
Okay, so another question from the audience, and this kind of builds on Petra's previous comment about the growth here. So how do you feel education influences this? Are these inventors being educated in the United States, or are they primarily really just working here? In other words, are they coming with the skill set, or is it being developed domestically? And how can education further encourage inventors in our classrooms?
So I think both. So for going back to the question you asked before, is like, it doesn't have to go through networks. Say if a really good teacher comes from abroad, so say as an example, in the mid 20th century, Germany was still leading in areas of organic chemistry. So you have somebody like that, or a mathematician, coming to the United States and then teaching people in these new methods, in methods that they maybe help develop. That's much more inspiring. Now, they never need to actually know the people that they've inspired. So, but they can teach them. They can be a large lecture hall, and there's all of a sudden there's this new knowledge spreading. And so that's the first part in which education, they become the educators. But I think another way is that, like, say, if a student who wants to come to the United States to study, that is a very specific person, right? It's a person who is willing to leave their friends and their family and everybody at home and go on their own to a different country to study. So the personality, even not thinking about intellectual capacity, is different, is kind of focused on learning and focused on achievement. And so I think we as economists, we don't really have a good way yet to quantify that. But I think there's some psychological underpinning that immigrants are just different. And so you get these people who coming as young people to the United States, and they're just different. So, and different in maybe not in a good way socially, like in sort of, they may not be nice friends, but in a good way that they are focused on learning and their work.
Yeah, I'll just pick up and say, I think of one part is that there is some part of immigration to the U.S. that is just different. If you look at the outer tail of Nobel Prize winners or election National Academy of Sciences, Paul Stefan's had a long history of showing that there is something different that happens out at that tail. But I would also point to another of our colleagues, Jennifer Hunt, who looked at the broader science and engineering workforce and innovative work, and began with the fact that I think Eric kicked this off, or maybe it was Arthur, you kicked it off, of saying when you look at the raw data, there's just more immigrants doing inventive work, and same would be true for firm starts. And what Jennifer very carefully showed was that you can explain most of that difference between natives and immigrants with two variables. One is the amount of education that has been attained. So did they finish undergraduate and go on to master's degrees or so forth? And the second was the field of study. And I found that very empowering. So obviously chemical engineering, or something that's more in the arts. And I found that very empowering because it does help us to understand the investment that has gone in to being successful in these places. And that it's not that there's some latent superpower in all of immigrants that is enabling this, but that they've done that, very hard work in order to be capable of doing the inventive work.
Yeah, very interesting. So we have another broad question and then a couple kind of more specific, I might say. So from Abir Saha, thank you for your thoughtful presentations. I'm curious to hear what both panels have to say about the relationship between the likelihood of immigration and the ease of citizenship or permanent residency. Is the US now missing out on the next wave of immigrant inventors because of how long it takes, at present, for migrants to obtain green cards and citizenship compared to places like Canada, that bill you showed us?
So I believe the answer is yes, we are pushing people away. A little bit of personal reflection. My wife is an immigrant to the country and then went through all of these, H-1B steps and then ultimately to green card and US citizenship. And I think it's important to recognize that the US immigration system has never been user-friendly. It was at any point in that process, we were like, oh, this has been made, to just a applicant stream. But it was always a relatively understandable process. You knew what you were doing at each step, and you knew that at the end of this, there was going to be this great opportunity on the opposite side. And forget that was being married to me, but like for her, but like for others. And what I think is really challenging in our present moment, in large part Trump administration, but then other political issues have swirled even since then, has been around to what degree can immigrants have that faith in the future of the country, and that it will be there when they complete what's an otherwise arduous process. And we know that all types of investment, whether it's to get married or do a chemical plant or something like that, buy a home, uncertainty is the thing that undoes that. And that uncertainty, more than the arduousness of the process, is what I worry most about.
Petra, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I agree. It's also this feeling of maybe not being welcome. If I have a choice between a place where they say like, hey, you're working hard, we would like to keep you here, and a place that says like, well, maybe not, then like, I think as a young person who decides where they will live and where they will have a family, I would probably say, well, let me go to the other place.
Right. So Petra, a couple specific questions to you. So when historical restrictions reduced the US invention by diverting inventors to other countries, did invention rise overseas kind of one for one? Did the total amount of invention globally fall as well? And can the available data tell us one way or the other?
So we would have to get the same data in other countries, and I told you, I've been collecting these data for 7 years and matching them with patents was no small undertaking. I don't know. That's I think the short answer, but actually I'm fairly certain that this was not a one-for-one transfer. Because in large part because these two episodes were episodes when people fled places that were not welcoming to scientists. So and it's not like in the 1920s or in the 1950s, it's not that the rest of the world said, oh yeah, we'll take them. Palestine said, yes, we'll take them. Argentina did to some extent if people had money. But many of these people just did not find a place to go and they died. So if you look through biographies of inventors and scientists in this period, many of them died. Many of them did not find a home and died. They were either killed or they actually also the trauma. So one thing I'm looking at right now is the effect of trauma on science. And so you actually see there's actually also a lot of suicide. So I think many of these people were just lost.
That's very powerful, especially if you look at kind of waves of people fleeing countries in, South and Latin America today, seeking to come to the US and what we might be missing in that. Couple other questions yet. One is from Gloria Chukwu. How did African immigrants fare and how have they changed the dynamics of immigrant innovation? For example, Nigerian immigrants are ranked among the most educated with undergraduate and graduate degrees in key fields.
I unfortunately don't have great answers to that question. I think in my work, it's been very difficult to distinguish African names in a consistent way over the period. Where you look at the case evidence, they significant contributions, and by all accounts, that's the growth engine for young talent over the decades that lie ahead. We'll have to observe a lot more about it.
And I was trying to look up Nigeria in my data, but I wasn't quick enough. So if you send me an email, I look it up and I see whether I have any Nigerians in my data. But I was literally trying to do it while Bill was talking. I was hoping he would talk longer.
I should have talked.
I don't know.
Well, we're nearing the end of our time in any case, but there's actually a wonderful question to kind of end on, which is from Art Malella here at Smithsonian, who asked whether either of you have looked at trends down immigrant generations to the second or third generation. So looking beyond the immediate immigrant, what is it you observe? What do you see?
So I have a little bit because I'm matching people with their parents. And so I think the children of immigrants in this data on the American Men of Science are extremely prominent and powerful. One of my favorite examples there is Richard Feynman, whom we think as an American physicist, the quintessential American physicist. But Richard Feynman would not have made it to the United States had the immigration quotas be passed earlier, because both of his parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe.
We've done just a touch of it. In the entrepreneurship space, you can observe that second generation has a proclivity towards entrepreneurship at relatively young ages that seems to sit in between, US born of Anglo-Saxon origin, for example, and first generation immigrant from their country. So there does seem to be a straddling between them. But it's relatively understudied, and yet it's got to be of enormous importance, because go back to Petra's, Lyndon Johnson signing the immigration reform bills. We're just now going to really start to see the second and third generation, impacts of the great immigration waves that followed from that.
Excellent, excellent. So two closing comments or points to make. So first, to the audience, everyone, thank you very much for joining us, and we encourage you strongly to come back tomorrow, same time, using the Zoom registration links again. It is free and open to all. And tomorrow's session will feature two immigrant inventors telling us firsthand accounts, as well as a special presentation of historical perspective featuring some of the collections at the National Museum of American History. And with that, I'd like everyone to kind of join me in applauding our wonderful speakers, Petra Moser, William Kerr. That was a fantastic program. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.